everyone. My name is Julie Garden Robinson, and I'm your host for today's Field to Fork webinar. This is brought to you by North Dakota State University Extension, and we welcome you, especially if you are joining us from a watch party. Glad to have all of you. We're celebrating a milestone in 2025. This is actually the 10th year we've done the Field to Fork webinar series. We've reached thousands of people with information about growing, preparing, and preserving fruits and vegetables, and also best practices for food entrepreneurs. We've archived all of the more than 100 webinars, including all of this year's webinars, and the link is always on our Field to Fork webinar page. As this next slide shows, today is the final webinar for the season, and we hope you join us next year. If you missed any of them, be sure to watch the archives, and you can learn about a lot of different topics. The next slide shows the webinar controls. And because of the large number of participants, we invite you to post your questions and comments in the chat, and I will pose those to the speaker after he is done today. So let's practice. Please find the chat box that looks like a caption, and you can ignore Q&A. I'm not going to look at that. I'm just going to follow the chat and type your city and state where you are right now and your current outside temperature. The next slide provides an acknowledgement. So as you work on this little assignment I just gave you, I have a special request. This program is sponsored in part with grant funding from the USDA's Agricultural Marketing Service, and I'll ask all of you to complete the short online survey that will be emailed right after today's webinar. And as a thank you, we will continue to provide several prizes to the lucky winners of the random drawings. Please be sure to include your complete address on the follow-up form, including your city, state, and zip code so that we can get you your prize. And be sure also to scroll down to today's date. Again, I welcome you to today's webinar, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker. Carlos Pires is a native of Brazil, and he graduated from Kansas State University with a PhD in agronomy. Dr. Pires's research expertise includes regenerative agriculture, soil health, nutrient management, and applied soil biology. As an assistant professor and extension soil health specialist at NDSU, his primary objective is to monitor and improve soil health by identifying agricultural practices that promote integrated and resilient agroecosystems. And much of his research is based on-farm research, providing data-driven recommendations to help farmers, and also all of you, enhance your sustainability of your gardens and your overall operations. So welcome, Carlos. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Julie, for this introduction, and I'm so happy to be here. And such a challenge for me to talk about soil health in a more broad way than I'm used to when I'm talking to usually farmers and ranchers. So we have our non-discrimination statement before we get started, and I just wanted to, before even dive into soil health, make sure you have a good understanding of what a soil is, right? So, and what the composition of a soil is. So now I want you to think on a bucket of soil, all right? And that's your 100% volume. So that's everything that you have. When the soil is inside of that bucket, you have actually not only soil per se, but you also have air, water, organic matter, and minerals. So ideally, this composition would be about 25% air and 25% water with 5% organic matter, and then about 45% minerals. I want you to think with me what would happen if we increase the water fraction. Just think for a second. If I have that bucket, I have my 100%, 25% is water. What happens if I do 50% of water? Since this is a volume, something needs to get out, right? So in this case, if I increase the water to 50%, most likely what is getting out is air. So then I'm going to have a flooding, or I'm going to be very close to water saturation, for example. So again, for something to get in, something needs to get out. So now think with me, what happens if I increase the mineral fraction? And when I say the mineral fraction, I'm talking about clay, silt, and sand. If I increase the mineral fraction, that means I'm actually putting more solids into that bucket. To put more solids, something needs to get out. So I'm going to have compaction, because I'm going to have to compact that soil in. And then water and mostly air will actually get out of the system, and that compaction will happen. So, and then I have a last question for you. Can we change the mineral fraction in the soil? And here's is something that is a little bit different than I usually say to my audience. So if you think on a farmer, if it's like 5 acres or 10 acres or 10,000 acres, the answer usually is no, you can't change the mineral fraction. That's the natural amount of clay, silt, and sand that you have in your soil. But if you are in a small production, like I have my own garden in my backyard, so I can definitely change the mineral fraction in there. I can just buy some topsoil, some organic matter, compost, and then really change that fraction. So this is something very interesting here, because in agronomy, we usually say we can't change the texture of our soil, which is the composition and the percentages of these minerals. But in fact, on our home garden, we can definitely change that fraction over time. Organic matter, as I said, 5% is the ideal. So we are very blessed in the upper Midwest to have to be able to achieve this 5%, which is very different to some other places where achieving 5% is really challenging. So the reason that in the upper Midwest, our soils are rich in organic matter, or they used to be rich in organic matter. We're going to understand a little bit more about that later. Well, one is because the glacial activity, if you were in the valley, so the Agassiz Lake, for example. So our soils here, they are very young because the glaciers cover the soil. The soil haven't had as much exposure to wind and water, and of course temperature as well. And so our native vegetation, if you think on the prairie vegetation that occupied much of this area until about 150 years ago. So these crops, I have a few figures here. So the prairie vegetation had very deep root system, which contributes to building up organic matter over time. And then of course climate. So our short growing seasons and hard winters prevent soil organic matter degradation. A good example here for you to think is if a farmer implement a practice that degrades organic matter, that burns, eliminates organic matter here in North Dakota, and a farmer, let's say in Oklahoma, implements the same practice, the farmer from Oklahoma will lose a lot more organic matter over time. And that is simply because of temperature that will increase biological activity and will just like burn organic matter faster. So that the soils, not only if you think in the South, but just being a little bit more extreme, comparing, for example, the US with Brazil, which is mostly tropical. So soils in Brazil or in the south will be way more weathered because of this, because of the moisture in and of course temperature. So that is the reason I said farmers in the upper Midwest or growers, they are blessed to have these more rich organic matter soil. Why used to be? So that's a little bit more complex question, which will pretty much drives my presentation today because we talk about soil health. because our soils were healthy at some point, and because of practices that were implemented, our soil became less healthy. And now we are trying to go back to that initial state. This is one of the reasons we talk about regenerative agriculture, because we want to regenerate our soils and make them a little bit more resilient. So whenever we have a change, they will return to their original state or very close to that. So here I have a figure showing data from the two oldest research plots in the US. So on the top here, I have the moral plots. They are in Illinois, they are in Champaign, and they this study is the oldest one that we have in the country, and both of them are about effect of tillage and crop rotation on soil carbon. The bottom one here is from Missouri, is the Sanborn field. So in both studies, we lost anywhere from 35 to 70% of organic carbon, which can be used interchangeably with organic matter. I know it gets a bit complex, but the reason we use these terms interchangeably is because organic matter is composed by an average 57% of carbon, right? The key difference between organic carbon and organic matter is that organic matter also holds other nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus, while organic carbon is simply carbon. So for this presentation, we're going to use the terms interchangeably. I want you to think always on the carbon aspect of it. The reason we lost carbon over time is because of removed organic matter through tillage, monoculture and cropping practices that limits carbon return, increased erosion rates and soil degradation. I'm not happy to say what I saw in the Red River Valley this winter was obscene. It's might be one of the worst erosion states I've ever seen in my life when I refer to wind erosion, which is the main problem that we have. So that's still happening, and we are losing carbon. Here's an idea for a business for you. If you want to just bag the soil you find in the ditches, I'm sure these soils are extremely rich in a lot of nutrients and can be used as fertilizer. It's just one of the examples of why we lost carbon over time. And then, of course, reduced soil biodiversity and functionality and increased use of external inputs. External inputs is not a crime, it's not a problem, but it becomes a problem when you solely use external inputs for production. What do I mean about external inputs? Fertilizer, herbicide, fungicide, insecticide, um, manure, compost, irrigation, right? So these are all external. So they are not natural from that soil specifically. You're bringing from an external source. So whenever you're using these external inputs that are getting every year more expensive, we want to make sure we are using those efficiently. Soils, they are not only for growing vegetables or other crops. Soils provide many ecosystem services that support life on Earth. And then before diving deeper into soil health, I just wanted to share that with you, because soil is way more important, as I said, than just having tomatoes and having peppers and lettuce or whatever you want to have in there. But it's key for flood regulation. It's a great source of pharmaceuticals and genetic resources. It's important for the foundation for human infrastructure, cultural heritage, provision of food, fiber and fuel, carbon sequestration, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, water purification, and so on. There are so many functions that soils that they perform, and a healthy soil is able to perform all these functions and deliver the ecosystem services that we expect from the soil. One important aspect of soils is the soil biodiversity, and which we know very little about. So soil biodiversity is the variety of life that we have below ground. And I know this is kind of a busy slide, but I just wanted to bring some of these facts for you. One is that soil is home to more than 25% of our planet's biodiversity. Yet we know only 1% of all this universe. So we know very, very little about biodiversity in soils. More than 40% of the living organisms in terrestrial ecosystems are associated during their life cycle directly with soils. And soils contain the most diverse terrestrial communities on the planet. So, from these facts, my favorite one is that 50% of the planet's soil passes through the gut of earthworms every year. This is for me is just incredible. And also that the weight of bacteria in 1 hectare, which is about 2 acres of soil, is equivalent to the weight of 2 cows. So there's a lot of soil biodiversity and a lot of functions that the soil performs to us that sometimes you're just not aware. Um, and one of my favorite talks is always to talk about the hidden society, how soil microbes shape soil health. And I wanted to bring a little bit of that. So I have probably 3 or 4 slides from that here for you. But it's pretty much telling you what are soil microbes, and what they do in the soil. So microbes are the incredibly diverse and abundant microscopic organisms that we have in the soil. Okay, includes bacteria, fungi, archaea, protozoa, and so on. And we call them microorganisms because they are very small. And the only way we can see them is using a microscope. Just want to bring this example here. We're going to compare, for example, earthworms and mites with protozoa, fungi, and bacteria. So this uses the metric system. So I want you to imagine that an earthworm measures 2 millimeters, right? So 2 millimeters is 2000 micrometers. So now let's think on this proportion, right? 2000 micrometers. You have that number. A mite measure 1,000, right? So mite is already small, measures 1,000. Earthworm measures 2,000. If we think on bacteria, fungi, and protozoa, bacteria measures 1 micrometer. Again, 1 micrometer compared to 1,000 micrometers of a mite and 2,000 micrometers of earthworm. Fungi is just a little bit bigger than bacteria, an average about 16 micrometers, and then protozoa about 32. So we are talking about 1, 16, and 32 compared to, let's say, 1,000, which is when most of us will start to clearly see these microbes or these insects in the soil. And then the challenge with this is that, as I said, we know very little about the biodiversity and soil microbes. In contrast, the physical and the chemical components of soil health, they are very well understood, and there are many already established quantification methods that are accessible to growers. You can take a soil sample, for example, send to a lab for phosphorus and potassium. For physical properties, you can pretty much do the same, at least 1 or 2 physical properties the commercial labs they offer. Now, when it comes to biologicals, is a little bit different. It's not every single lab that will offer microbial analysis, for example. So there's still a lot to be discovered. One example is that we know only about 100,000 species of fungi, of an estimated 5 million species, and we know um, about 5,000 species of bacteria in the soil, in contrast to an estimated 1 billion species that we have. So there's still a knowledge gap between the chemical, the physical, and the biological properties in the soil. And just to make sure you have an understanding of the difference between these microbes, this is very simple here. But bacteria are simple single-cell microorganisms. Bacteria grows really fast, and you can see sometimes bacteria growing at your own homes. They requires a lot of energy. One reason that bacteria have a high activity in tilled soils after a tillage is really because when you are doing tillage, you are flushing a lot of nutrients. So you are releasing nutrients that were previously protected within soil aggregates. So bacteria will just use that and grow exponentially. And then there are different types of bacteria, of course, but one important differentiation within the bacterial community, is a little bit of the physiology and the difference between a gram-positive and a gram-negative bacteria. So the gram-positive tends to be a little bit more water stress resistant. So they come as in all shapes. So as you can see over here, and a few examples, just E. coli, maybe the most famous one, not because of a good reason, but then rhizobium, which is responsible for nitrogen fixation. So whenever you have a legume, a plant, and you see those small nodules in the root, so those are bacteria that are fixing nitrogen. It's getting nitrogen from the atmosphere and making it available for plants. Nitrobacter, Nitrosomonas, different bacteria, extremely important for nitrification. So there's no conversion of organic nitrogen, the nitrogen that is in the organic matter, to a nitrogen form that plants can use without this nitrification process. So these bacteria are key in the process. And Azospirillum is just a bacteria that promotes root growth. When we get to fungi, so they are the opposite of bacteria. They are not unicellular, they are multicellular organisms, and they are the best known fungi are mushrooms, molds, and yeast. And then fungi grow as long strands called hyphae, and then a bunch of hyphae, a network of hyphae is called mycelium, and can be grouped as decomposers, mutualism, or pathogen. So the good, the bad, and the ugly. A few examples here is penicillium, which is used to produce an antibiotic. So trichoderma is used for biological control of insects. Muscular mycorrhizal fungi, this one right here, you can see the vesicles in there. So they are very important for nutrient uptake by plants. And then fusarium is just a plant pathogen. A group that we don't talk much about, but they're very important, protozoa. So they primarily eat bacteria, and so the bacteria usually contains more nitrogen than the protozoa can utilize. So then some ammonia is released to plants. So that means some nitrogen is released to plants, and plants can make a use of that. The role of these microbes, I briefly touched on some of that, but bacteria overall is really important to decompose nitrogen-rich material. So that means they are important to decompose plants like legumes and brassicas. When I say legumes, it could be just like clover, vetch, and things like that. While a poor nitrogen material would be grasses, which have way more carbon compared to nitrogen. But what I want to say here is that bacteria will prefer the ribeye and the T-bone, while fungi will be able to take care of a chuck roast and a brisket, for example. So bacteria prefer things that are already somewhat decomposed, and then we release those nutrients that are might be still not accessible to other organisms. Bacteria, they are also important to help binding soil particles into soil aggregates because of polysaccharides. Fungi, incredibly important for soil aggregation because of the hyphae and then the mycelia, just that network of hyphae. As I said, they decompose high carbon to nitrogen ratio materials, lignin, rich in lignin, just like grasses overall. Also break down nutrients that bacteria wouldn't be able to have access before. Arbustor mycorrhizal fungi, wanted to separate this special type of fungi here because it's key for healthy soils. They allow plants to uptake or absorb more phosphorus and nitrogen. They improve aggregation not only because of the hyphae and the mycelium, but also because it releases a glycoprotein to the soil, which works kind of as a glue to bind soil particles together. And then the protozoa, as I said, they are great decomposers and they regulate microbial populations because they consume bacteria over time. So a little bit of microbes and what they do in the soil. One often part of the soil microbial community that we don't talk about are soil enzymes. So they are not microbes, they are proteins produced by microbes and also by plants. They pretty much speed up or accelerate biochemical reactions. One example here is the transformation of residue straw into organic matter. They are essential for nutrient cycling because of these reasons, and the nutrient cycling of the different elements. As an example, we have enzymes that will be linked to the carbon cycle, to the phosphorus cycle, sulfur, nitrogen, and so on. So these are going to show later that this is are one of the things that we measure in terms of soil health. If you are more advanced in the soil health arena, so enzymes is something that a few labs offers for you to have data on. Now, getting into soil health per se, and I wanted to bring this figure so you don't get confused with somewhat similar terms, right? So soil health, this is a USDA definition, is the capacity of the soil to function as a living ecosystem and sustain plants, animals, and humans. So it brings the aspect that's not only my vegetable, my crop, but it's actually animals and humans as well. Cybersecurity is a term that sometimes it is related, it's a related concept, but it's different. Cybersecurity is usually more used in a global scale, okay? And it's more about global and national policy. So it's of more interest for global and national policymakers. I think that's probably, cybersecurity is probably different enough so we have a good understanding of that. Now, it got a little bit more complicated when we start talking about soil health, soil quality, and soil fertility. Same way I mentioned, we use organic matter and organic carbon interchangeably. Soil health and soil quality is pretty much the same thing. Okay, so soil quality is a term that is used in academia by scientists, and then soil health was a term that was created so our general public would relate more to that as for example human health. So you can have a good idea that soil health might be related to the same way soil health for soils is related as human health for humans. So you have a better understanding. Now if you get into like human quality, that gets a little bit more complicated in there, and that's the reason, as I said, so health is a little bit more appealing to the general public. But um, even in academia, we use sometimes those terms interchangeably, and soil quality is supposed to be more scientific, while soil health is supposed to be more extension-based type of terminology. But it talks about carbon sequestration, water cycling, the biodiversity aspect of things, and things like that. Economic viability is really important when you are implementing practices that are soil health tailored and so on. So soil health and soil quality very, very similar, both more on the national regional scale. However, more recently, soil health has become also important in the local scale, and there's a lot of research on that local scale nowadays. Soil fertility, though, is different. Okay, so soil fertility is really related to plant production, right? And then is really is productivity. It's how much of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as an example, some of these macronutrients that my plants need. So that's soil fertility. If you take a soil sample and you analyze that for nitrogen, for phosphorus, potassium, and sulfur, for example, it doesn't mean you are assessing soil health. You are really assessing soil fertility. Of course, soil fertility affects soil health, and soil health affects soil fertility, but these are not the same thing, and shouldn't be confused. Soil health is more a holistic approach. Okay, if you're thinking nutrient management, that's really more soil health. But then if it's just like the providing that nutrient to a plant and receiving a soil testing result and then trying to come up with fertilizer rates. So then that's really soil fertility that you are thinking about. And and the main reason for that is because soil health needs to be faced as the interconnection between chemical, physical, and biological soil properties. Right. So you it gets, you know, you can't take a soil sample, send to a lab, and ask for a soil health number. Right? There are some indices out there which will use more than one thing to create indices, right? So indices means a bunch of numbers together, then they do some math, and then they will come up with like a single um, um, number with no units, right? So that's an indices. So soil health is really the interconnection between all those things. And I love this figure that I put together a few years ago, which is what my one of my mentors used to call the soil health holy trinity. Because soil health is really about these three things that we have in the soil: um, organic carbon, which or organic matter, which is our chemical component, which is the food for microbes, which are our biological component, which will then transform our poor soil in a healthier soil, building soil structure, which will then retain water and so on, which is our physical component. So chemical, biological, physical. So this is how soil health is interconnected. Now you might be asking yourself, what is a healthy soil? So how do I know if my soil is healthy or what does it look like? And that can be very tricky. And here's one example for you. If you use fertilizer or if you have one single application of compost, for example, or topsoil or something like that, that soil might be rich in nutrients. So you will provide every single nutrient that a plant needs. Now, that means the soil is healthy? Not necessarily, because you may have compaction, you may have drainage problem, you may have a very dead, poor soil with no living organisms. So as I said, it can be tricky, but overall, a healthy soil will hold water and air in a good balance, 25-25%, as I mentioned on the ideal composition. It will have dead plants and organic matter, that 5% in there, and then it will have living organisms and life in that soil. So here's just an example of what could an unhealthy soil look like and a healthy soil look like. So an unhealthy soil will have poor structure. It may have high salt, so high salinity, in a weak growth. While a healthy soil will have a stable structure, a beneficial organism like worms will be present, and you're going to have a very good growth for crops. I say this is tricky because it could be the other way around, right? If I change the healthy for the unhealthy here, I could say that this soil might be unhealthy because I'm not seeing a lot of residue on top. I'm not seeing protection against erosion. I'm not necessarily seeing a very good aggregation in there. And this soil here on my left, which I have the pointer on top, so this soil might be just under dry conditions. And then it's just not holding enough moisture because it was extremely dry. So it can be tricky, but I'm going to show you how you can measure soil health so you can for sure tell if the soil is healthy or not. Before we get into that, I want to share with you the soil health principles, which pretty much helps us to have a healthy soil. If I have an unhealthy soil, I want to make some transformation there. So these are the principles that you should be applying. And again, I just like to bring these external inputs, which means irrigation, compost, fertilizer, and other things. So these are becoming very expensive because of many reasons, global aspects and financial aspects of it. So whenever we are using them, if I'm not in an organic production, if I'm on a more just the regenerative side of things, but not necessarily 100% organic, make sure to make the most efficient use of external inputs. Even if you are an organic system, you still need water, for example. So make sure you are using water wisely. The first soil health principle is minimize disturbance. I do understand that for some crops that's almost impossible, mostly for when you harvest the root. Example here could be potatoes or thinking more on a larger scale, sugar beets, for example. So I know it's very challenging to produce these crops in a no tillage or minimum tillage system, but I've seen some very successful farmers growing that on a strip tillage system, which is a huge change from a highly disturbed soil. The second principle is maximize soil cover. And then some options we have would be cover crops or just residue management. Think on your cropping system as a whole. Maybe if you have a very degraded soil that needs some recover, so you can do perennials in there for a while. Maximize biodiversity, and then thinking on again on the crop rotation, the plant diversity that you're going to have in the soil, not only the cash crop or the crop we're interested in, but also the cover crop and how you organize your rotation over time. Remember that if you're eating always the same thing, you get bored and maybe not healthy. If you have that diversity, those all those colors out, that goes the same way for microbes. They want that diversity of root systems because what the roots deliver to them is different based on the plant's species. And then maximize continuous living roots, just thinking again, cover crops and avoid fallow. And the main reason for that is because of soil erosion. Again, think on the principles, not necessarily in these practices, because the practice they need to be put in a context. Maybe this practice that I mentioned here won't work for you, but you can get creative to try to get close to the principles and then be more successful. In terms of the soil health journey, soil health can be frustrating, and the main reason is because if you implement a soil health oriented practice in the first year, maybe you won't see the outcome. And that's okay. And the reason is because some of the outcomes they are invisible, just like biological activity. As I said, without a microscope, you can't really see that. But that's a very important step. With the biological activity, you're going to transform residue into organic matter, which will then improve nutrient cycling because organic matter will release nutrients. And then you start to see these outcomes, which is the improved soil structure and then improved water availability and drainage. So soil health is a long-term commitment, maybe a mid-term commitment. So just don't get frustrated if in 1 or 2 years you're not seeing those outcomes out there. Now that we understand the journey, how can we tell whether we are climbing up or slipping down the soil health mountain? We use indicators for that. Okay, but soil health indicators are not an end to themselves. They are actually tools that help to translate management practices into our desired outcomes. So some of these indicators, and these are some of the common indicators, I'm going to list some of them here. And then I want you to think again on the soil health journey because biology is one of the first things that we see. They are the most sensitive indicators. And then we have soil chemistry, and then we have soil physical properties, which usually takes a little bit more time to have, for example, available water capacity or just a better drainage so I don't have flooding. Within the soil biology arena, so some of the things that are frequently measured are respiration, soil respiration, which is pretty much the rate at microbes degrade carbon in the soil. It could be muscular mycorrhizal fungi. You could measure the number of earthworms or soil proteins, enzymes, as I said, or microbial profiling, so you know what kind of microbes you have in the soil. And this is why we know very little still about this, because most of these analyses are still very expensive and are not available in every single commercial lab in the USA. Now, when we get into soil chemistry, a lot more well known, and as an example, macro and micronutrients are widely available in soil testing labs. So you can just take a soil sample and have those number for a way lower price compared to the biology side of things. But organic matter, it's a very important one. And here's my recommendation. Do not measure any biological property if you're not at least measuring organic matter. That's the most important one by far, because that's one of the only ones that will kind of walk around this tripod of soil health. So organic matter have a huge effect on both biology, chemistry, and physical properties. But pH, salinity content, heavy metals, all these things are all chemical properties. And then the physical properties, they are usually related to water and temperature, or compaction, just like bulk density is a measure of compaction. You could be using resistance to penetration, which is how resistant the soil is to the penetration of roots. There's an equipment to measure that. Aggregate stability, which is how well aggregated our soil is, available water capacity, water field pore space. It could be soil water infiltration. It could be hydraulic conductivity, and so on. It can get complex. But these are some of the most common indicators for soil health assessment. Now, here's one example of the management indicator outcome process. Remember that the indicator is not the end, it's the mean for you to see if that outcome is happening or not. The question here is, how do I manage soil microbes? Okay, so most microbes are found in the rhizosphere, and rhizosphere is the area surrounding plant roots. So it's just like a party for microbes. So many of the microbes will be surrounding these areas over here. Okay, so my management in this case is the use of cover crops. And here I have purple top turnip. This one is radish. This one here is a mix of um, sun hemp and millet, if I'm not wrong. Here we have a root of sorghum Sudan. So this is our management. Our indicators in this case, which are the things I measured, are aggregates, fungi, and carbon. To keep it simple, on the x-axis here at the bottom, we have the amount of fungi, and then on the going from south to north here, we have aggregates. What we are seeing here is the more fungi we have in the soil, the more aggregates we have in the soil. There's a linear relationship. On the second one here is, again, the more fungi, in this case, the more carbon. It isn't as linear as the aggregation, but still we can say the more fungi, the more carbon we have. So the management was cover crops. The indicators were carbon, fungi and aggregates. The outcome is higher organic matter, soil organic matter, and increased biodiversity. Okay, so knowing the expected outcome is really important to decide what soil health indicator you're going to use. And super important as well is to monitor soil health over time, because you need to know whether you are just sustaining soil health over time, or you are degrading or improving soil health, as an example. So you probably noticed that I mentioned cover crops a few times already, and soil health and cover crops, they are great friends. And I just wanted to bring this example here. So the practical farmers of Iowa, they had a survey in there to understand where they should place most of the research emphasis. So 51% responded soil health and 43 cover crops. So soil health and cover crops, they were top two for this survey in Iowa. When it comes to cover crops, one important thing is to use them with a purpose and remember they are service plants. They offer us something. I shouldn't use cover crop just because, or because my neighbor used. You need to use cover crops with a purpose, because they are gonna, at the end of the day, offer a service to you. Is it compaction your problem? Is it because you want nitrogen fixation and put nitrogen into the system? Is it erosion? Is it green manure? So thinking on the cover crops you're going to use based on these. Of course, a few cover crops, they will work as green manure. They will prevent erosion, nitrogen fixation, and they will break up compaction. But it's not all of them. So think on this services that this cover crop offers. So here are just a few examples. If I want nitrogen fixation, I need to use a legume like hairy vetch, clover, sun hemp. If my problem is erosion, I need to think more on a grass like cereal rye or triticale, which are more like fall winter cover crops, or Sudan grass or millet, which are more summer cover crops on there. So always think on that purpose and why you are selecting these cover crops. About the benefits, so overall, when uh, uh, used in a smart way will improve soil health. It may increase yields, will build up organic matter for sure. It will improve rainfall infiltration, will help to control weeds and so on. So there are so many benefits that come out of these cover crop use. Here, I wanted to share with you a very nice tool to select cover crops. This is a cover crop decision tool that the Midwest Cover Crop Council offers. The website is right here. You can just Google cover crop decision tool MCCC, which is the Midwest Cover Crop Council. You're going to find that for sure. But I just wanted to show you this example here where I use North Dakota as the state of my farm or of my garden. And then I use Cass County because it's where I am in Fargo. And then the goal for this cover crop was erosion fighter, right? So it will give me a list of cover crops that are good for fighting erosion in North Dakota at the Cass County. And then they're going to classify that. So the color here will show you um, the timing of the year where you can have a reliable establishment or the timing of the year where there's some risk to that establishment and usually is related to temperature and water availability. But and then you have the numbers here that goes from 4 to 0 if it's an excellent cover crop to fulfill the goal, if it's just a very good or good, fair, or poor. Based on this tool, the best cover crop for fighting erosion in the Cass County is cereal rye, which you can plant from July 1st. It's saying November 1st. I will be careful here. It's more like October 1st, maybe, to avoid winter kill of that cereal rye. And cereal rye is a cover crop with the capacity to over winter. So you may have to terminate that cover crop in the following year. So here on another example, so now my goal was a weed fighter, and then it will just give me the cover crops that are more um, 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 they are ideal for fighting weeds or to prevent weeds or to provide some weed suppression. So very nice tool to be used. Another tip for you is to consider always a target cash crop. And here it's important. I love this figure from the University of Minnesota because you can go very easy or harder in terms of cover crops. You could, for example, have your vegetables from April to August, and then you're gonna just do a cover crop is not very winter hardy. Just you could do oats, for example, and then it would just dies over winter. It can get a little bit more complex where you're going to plant cover crops after the harvest of your vegetables, but that cover crops is winter hardy, just like cereal rye. And then you're going to have to terminate that cover crop in the following year before planting your cash crop. Or you can get even more complex to have some vegetables in April and May, and then you have a summer cover crop, and then you have again some other short season vegetables or crops in August and before September, before the first frost, for example. So you can play along and try to increase the complexity of your production based on your skills. I think this option of a summer cover crop might be a very good one if you have a degrade soil and you need some high biomass crops. And it's an opportunity here for millet, for example, for sorghum Sudan, some of these very high residue crops if you have an important degradation problem. I love this cover crop chart from the USDA ARS as well. You're going to show you what are the cover crop species that are for cool season or warm season, and then they also separate between grass, broadleaf, and legume down here. And they also show you the growth cycle if it's annual, annual, or perennial, and also about plant architecture or relative water use. If these cover crops will use a lot of water, just medium or high use of water. Termination is important. If you go with cover crops, they'll be overwinter, or you're gonna plant still something after summer cover crops. So It's very important to consider the cover crop species, the growth stage, the weather, and always think on a balance between the benefits and potential penalties to the next crop. When I say that is, say if I'm in a more kind of a dry area, excuse me, in a more in a dry area, you may want to limit the growth of the cover crop so you still have water for your cash crop if you don't have irrigation, for example. If you are in a wetter area, you actually may want to keep the cover crop a little bit longer to help to suck up the water out of the system. Natural termination is an option with just winter kill of summer or fall grasses and some other crops like radish, turnip, and peas. Chemical terminations, it could be the use of herbicide is an option out there. And then mechanical termination, you could just like tarping, you could use a roller crimper, a mower, a chain. You can be very creative on this mechanical termination. And just getting to the end of this presentation, I want to remind you that the soil is the foundation um, for nutrition. So soil degradation leads to the loss of soil micro and macronutrients. This is very important. And more than half of the world today suffers from a deficiency of micronutrients despite adequate daily caloric intake. And the first cause for this malnutrition is really soil deficiency. And this is one of the reasons that we really care about soil health and the reason soil is the foundation for this nutrition. So it's estimated that over 2 billion people suffer from these micronutrient deficiencies. And just to reinforce some of the practices that are important for a healthy soil, so ensure crop rotation, reduce erosion, keep the soil surface covered, minimize tillage whenever possible, and because these principles and practices will increase soil organic matter content over time and ensure a rich, healthy soil to produce healthy food. And then lastly, I wanted to bring the concept of One Health, which is the interaction between soil health, animal health, environmental health, and human health. So is a somewhat new concept that tells us that everything is interconnected. And I love this figure here because it really shows us the difference. And this is a very nice publication that shows the difference between a poor soil and a rich soil, and the linkage between the poor soil microbiome to the rich soil microbiome. So a poor soil with a poor soil microbiome will produce poor and deficient plants, which will, and these are usually linked to conventional agriculture, which uses tillage, which uses herbicides, which uses pesticides, and so on. So that will create a fragile health compared to a rich microbiome, a healthy rich soil microbiome, a healthy plant microbiome, healthy plants, healthy soil. Usually, you can still use some of the conventional ag approaches as long as always thinking on that efficiency and minimize that use. So let the mother nature work and you can get some extra help when you need. But biofertilizer, biostimulants, biocontrol of microbes or pathogens, things like that are always good for a good health. So it's a poor soil microbiome, poor health, and rich soil microbiome, rich health. So this is kind of the concept of One Health and how soil is actually affects the humans. With that, so I'm open to any question that you may have. Here's my email, and just wanted to acknowledge my team, my students. So they do a lot of hard work, and some of this data and numbers that we have is just because of their work. So a big thanks to them. Julie, back to you.
Big thanks to you, Carlos. We've never covered this topic, and soil health is very complex, as you can all see. I do have a number of questions that have popped in. Is it possible to have too much organic matter in a drought?
Uh, Answering these questions is always depend on the scale, right? If the question is, can I have a higher organic matter in a drought? Um, In a small scale, yes. If it's like a large field, probably not. That becomes hard. If I understood the question, if the question is really if you can build organic matter in dry areas, the answer is yes, you can definitely do that. There are a number of growers implementing practices that will still build up organic matter. Now it will take longer, so the soil health journey will be longer, but definitely it is possible.
Right, your next question. You know, in the fall, we get a lot of leaves coming down in the Midwest. Is using leaves a good cover in the fall and digging them into the soil in the spring?
Yes, it can be. I briefly touched one of the main drivers of organic matter is substrate quality. When I say substrate quality, I want you to think on residue, right? So let's say tomato um, plants, they will decompose very fast after you're dead because they are more there's a little bit more nitrogen compared um, to carbon. Now, if you think on the leaves from the Midwest coming down, so those are harder to degrade. And here is the risk. If you put too much like wood chips or these leaves in the soil, so it may be too much carbon, and then the microbes might be afraid that there's too much carbon, not a lot of nitrogen. They will tie up the nitrogen from the soil, they will immobilize that nitrogen, and then in the next year, you may have to supplement nitrogen because the nitrogen from the organic matter won't be available. So this is one of the risk factors in there. So it's an important source, but if you make a compost with that before, and put that in the soil with a certain degradation process, that's a little bit better.
I have a couple more. Are gypsum and organic matter still the best way to loosen heavily compacted clay soil?
Yes, organic matter by far the best you can do. Cover crops break up compaction like radish, turnips. So these are great. Gypsum is also important into the system. One thing that sometimes people confuse with gypsum is that will correct the pH of the soil if you have like acidity as a problem. Usually that's not the case, but it will tie up actually aluminum that won't be available for our plant anymore. But that can be used as a good soil conditioner um, uh, for us.
We have a related question, and this comes from one of our guests from Iowa. We have soil restoration offered in Iowa. It is compost that is collected from yard waste. Is it safe to assume that it is good for the yards without knowing what is in it?
This is a great question. Safe to assume. That's a big statement, right? It's hard to say safe to assume if on my case I don't know what you're talking about specifically. But here's one thing to think. Compost analyses are not super expensive. That can be done, and that will be probably the best way. I've done research on corn plots with 36 years now of compost application. So we do analysis on that compost. We send that to a lab because we want to know how much nitrogen or phosphorus or potassium is actually available in that, so we can make a good calculation and provide to our plants only what they need. Because sometimes the excess of nutrients might be a problem as well, and you're going to have toxicity. So analysis is key to then be able to to assume that is good. And that's the same thing for like compost tea, for example. I know a number of people that are using compost tea is the same thing. Do you actually know what is in there? So most likely you won't have any problem, but you don't actually know if that is helping or not. So, here and there doing some analysis, getting to know exactly what you are implementing, what you are spraying or spreading, it is always good.
So here's your last question. What are the differences among the different types of soil you can buy in bags at a garden center? We have topsoil, potting soil, garden soil, all sorts of things. What's the
Yeah,
difference?
No, this is a great question, and I was at one of these stores probably 5 or 6 days ago, and I saw all those bags in there, and I was just like, okay, oh my goodness, there's so many options in here. So I took some time and I got my phone and I started googling the differences. But overall, you can see the difference up front. Is really some of those soils they have a little bit more clay. Some of those they have a little bit more sand, which is what I was looking for. I wanted a lighter soil, and that wasn't for my garden. It was just for my yard. Um, but you have many options in there. So you have a compost with more or less organic matter, and the important part in there is always look at the label and see what they are offering. So some of them will have wood chips, for example. If it's more in a longer term type of thing, the wood chips they are just great because it will very slowly decompose. You may find that year after year, while some of those products in bags they are just almost pure organic matter, which will be decomposed like really quick. So those will offer nutrients immediately, for example. So there are so many options, even hard for me to keep track of all of those. But looking at the label is always key.
Well, I feel better now because this was my question and
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. So with that, I'm going to thank you, Carlos, for your time and expertise. And you're closing out this year's group of webinars, and I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everyone for being here. And I recognize some of your names as being stalwarts coming almost every week. So thank you for that. And we'll look forward to your suggestions as we begin to put together next year's lineup. So thank you all.